10 Things You Didn't Know About Jesse James. Jesse James is one of the most notorious outlaws in the history of the American Wild Wild West. When Jesse was still alive, America already loved him, for in him there was an adventure in an otherwise dull, slow-turning scientific age. So he became a legend in his own lifetime by committing crimes supposedly out of revenge for the poor treatment he, his family, and other Southern sympathizers received from Union soldiers during the Civil War. As a prominent member of the high-profile James Younger gang, his nefarious terrorizing and robbing of banks, stagecoaches, and trains in the mid to late 19th century automatically earned him celebrity status. On July 21, 1873, the American folk figure robbed his first train in Adair, Iowa with the help of his posse, the James Younger gang. The outlaws used stolen tools to pry up part of the track, pulling it aside with ropes as the train rounded a blind curve. They boarded the crashed train wearing white Ku Klux Klan masks and searched the safe they believed held gold bullion, only to be disappointed by a mere $2,000. They then collected valuables from passengers, bringing the total up to about $3,000. In addition to Jesse James' actions as a ruthless murderer, calculating robber, and elaborate showman were lesser-known characteristics. A man who was born to a prosperous family of slave-owning farmers, James was deeply loved by his mother throughout his life and went on to become a family man and father himself. After over 140 years, Jesse James remains one of the most iconic and romanticized figures in American history. And here are 10 things you didn't know about him. But before we get started, kindly be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification button so that you'll be able to get updates whenever we upload any new content. And now, let's begin. Number 10. Jesse James was the son of a preacher. Jesse Woodson James, born in Clay County, Missouri on September 5, 1847, was the son of Kentucky native Zerelda Cole James and her husband, Robert James. Robert was a Baptist minister and slave-owning hemp farmer who assisted in founding William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. In 1850, Robert James traveled to California to preach in the gold mining camps. However, not long after arriving, he became sick and died. Zerelda and her children Jesse, his older brother and future partner in crime Frank, and younger sister Susan were plunged into perilous financial straits. After a brief failed marriage to a wealthy older man, Zerelda returned for good to her first husband's farm with her children. Married again in 1855, he proceeded to have 4 more children. After Frank and Jesse grew up to become outlaws, the iron-willed Zerelda remained their staunch supporter. Number 9. He was nicknamed Dingus. Jesse earned the nickname Dingus after shooting off the tip of his finger while cleaning a pistol. Since he didn't like to swear, he reportedly said, "That's the dod-dingus pistol I ever saw." When his body was later exhumed for identification, his skeleton's missing finger proved key in proving that it was him. Number 8. He fought as a Confederate guerrilla in the U.S. Civil War. During the Civil War, the border state of Missouri was home to bitter fighting in which both sides of the conflict regularly murdered prisoners and civilians alike, mutilated enemy dead, looted property and livestock, and left towns and homes ablaze. His brother Frank James fought with the pro-secession Missouri State Guard at the start of the war, then joined a band of Confederate guerrillas known as bushwhackers, who carried out attacks against Union sympathizers on the frontier. In May of 1863, while at his family's farm, a teenage Jesse was ambushed and his stepfather hung from a tree by Union militiamen seeking the whereabouts of Frank and his fellow insurgents. That August, Frank took part in an infamous raid on the abolitionist town of Lawrence, Kansas, during which more than 150 men and boys were killed and numerous buildings destroyed. By age 16, Jesse followed Frank as a marauding bushwhacker, with both joining a ruthlessly violent gang led by William Bloody Bill Anderson. In one infamous September 1864 atrocity in Centralia, Missouri, the guerrillas forced 24 unarmed Union soldiers heading home on leave from a train and executed them. Then they slaughtered more than 100 federal troops trying to hunt them down. Number 7. He loved publicity. Jesse enjoyed courting publicity and was even known to hand out press releases to witnesses at the scenes of his crimes. Interesting, right? One read, "The most daring robbery on record. The southbound train on the Iron Mountain Railroad was stopped here this evening by 5 heavily armed men and robbed of dollars. The robbers were all large men, none of them under 6 feet tall. They were masked and started in a southerly direction after they had robbed the train, all mounted on fine-blooded horses. There's a hell of an excitement in this part of the country." Number 6. He was shot twice before he even became an outlaw. Before becoming an outlaw, Jesse was shot in the chest twice. The first was in 1864 when trying to steal a saddle from a farmer, while the second was in 1865. In May of 1865, a month after Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Jesse was shot in the chest during a skirmish with Union troops near Lexington, Missouri. After being nursed back to health by his cousin Zerelda Z. Mims, whom he would wed in 1874 and later have 2 children, Jesse eventually banded with his brother and other former Confederate guerrillas to rob banks, stagecoaches, and trains. Number 5. His gang was defeated trying to rob a Minnesota bank. On the afternoon of September 7, 1876, Jesse and Frank James, along with Cole, Jim, and Robert Younger and 3 other associates, tried to rob the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota. The gang targeted the bank after learning that Adelbert Ames, a former Union general and Republican governor of Reconstruction-era Mississippi, had recently moved to Northfield. Ames, along with his father-in-law Benjamin Butler, also a former Union general and radical Republican politician, was rumored to have deposited $75,000 in the bank. During the attempted robbery, 3 members of the gang went inside and demanded the cashier open the safe, but he refused. Meanwhile, after townspeople outside got wind that a holdup was taking place, they engaged in a shootout with the gang members who had been stationed on the street. In the end, the gang killed the bank cashier and a passerby, while 2 bandits were shot to death by townsfolk before the rest of the outlaws fled. Number 4. He was a family man. In 1874, Jesse married his first cousin Zerelda, who he had been courting for 9 years. They had 2 children. James was known to be a family man who loved his wife and enjoyed spending time with his children. Number 3. He wasn't a Wild West Robin Hood. As a key and most famous member of the James Younger gang, Jesse became one of the most notorious outlaws of the American West. Popular portrayals of James embody him as Robin Hood, who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. However, there's no evidence that the gang shared any of their loot. Instead, from 1860 to 1862, the gang were responsible for more than 20 bank and train robberies, countless murders, and the theft of around $200,000. The gang's noble image was actually carefully crafted with the help of editor John Newman Edwards, who wrote articles about the gang stating, "The James gang are men who might have sat with Arthur at the Round Table, ridden in tourney with Sir Lancelot, and won the colors of Guinevere." Number 2. He was killed by a member of his own gang. In April of 1882, Jesse James was killed in undramatic fashion while dusting a framed piece of embroidery that read, "In God We Trust," on the wall of his rented home in Missouri. His wife and 2 children were also in the house at the time. His assassin, who shot him in the back of the head, was Bob Ford, a recent recruit in the James gang. He had agreed with the governor of Missouri to shoot James in exchange for a reward and legal immunity. The public was transfixed and perceived the assassination to be cowardly, since James was facing away. Nonetheless, the Fords soon began reenacting the event in a traveling show. Bob Ford was eventually shot and killed in 1894. Number 1. His remains were exhumed. Following James' passing, speculation lingered that he had faked his own death and that someone else was buried in his grave. Over the years, several different men claimed to be Jesse James. In 1995, scientists seeking to resolve the question of who was buried in James' grave exhumed his supposed remains from Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, Missouri, where the remains had been transferred in 1902 from the original burial site on the James family farm. After conducting DNA testing, the researchers concluded the exhumed remains were almost certainly those of the infamous 19th century outlaw. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Goodbye.